Joining us now for an exclusive interview here in London, Arriagada, who is the CEO of Antofagasta. Very good to have you with us. Thank you for coming to talk to us. This is LME week, of course, so many in your industry in town, and we'll be speaking to many people who are here for LME week. So tell me your thoughts on the price. There we heard the thoughts of Goldman Sachs. They say it's going to stay around $7,000 a tonne in the shorter term or in the next few years. Do you see that? Is that in your calculations?
Look, I think the outlook for copper is very positive. I think on the demand side, emerging markets continue to drive a lot of physical demand. China demand for copper is expected to grow this year above 4%. And also in other parts of the world, like the US and Europe, demand is actually, physical demand is quite strong. On the supply side, copper is in shortage. Generally, you have declining grades, and therefore it's a commodity which is supply constrained. So I think the outlook for price, therefore, is positive, is favorable. I think we've seen prices come down as of June, July, but that has been largely the result, I think, of macroeconomic uncertainty around trade wars. But beyond that noise, which I think may prevail in the short term, I think mid-term, the outlook is very positive, and prices, therefore, I think, are bound to increase from here onwards.
Is it just noise, the trade tension, or do you see evidence of it in demand?
We have not really seen evidence in demand. As I was saying, physical demand is actually quite strong. And one of the reasons being is that most of the copper that goes into emerging markets, if you take the case of China, for example, stays there. So 80% of the copper that's exported into China, that goes into that market, stays there in the form of infrastructure or consumables, and therefore does not get re-exported. So the direct impact of a potential trade war on copper consumption in emerging markets we see as moderate or limited.
We talked there about the supply story and Goldman Sachs' view of this deficit that could emerge in some years. So if that is the backdrop, are you looking to invest more, to find more sources, or to spend more on M&A to secure supplies?
I think on the supply side, we've said copper is constrained. I mean, there are not a lot of new deposits that you could develop. We in Antofagasta have a couple of very important districts which are world-class from the point of view of the mineral reserves that they hold. And yes, we're looking over time to develop them, progressively. So one of the projects that we have in the short term involves growing moderately in one of those districts, in the Pelambres district.
So you do have those plans. Do you have plans for more M&A, though? I mean, there's a lot of Chinese buying, it seems, in the sector. And so there are some who are concerned that maybe prices are going to become elevated because of a lot of competition from Chinese buyers trying to secure supply.
I think one of the things that we've certainly learned, over the years is that keeping capital discipline in the way that we undertake a project is fundamental. So I think we're very keen on developing our own districts and the copper reserves that we have, but we're going to do that very deliberately over time, sequentially and progressively, but keeping capital discipline and the financial strength of a balance sheet. So we're not expected to undertake, significant M&A, or nor is the industry expected to do that. And as I say, largely because there are no new deposits either in the market that you could look at. So
M&A doesn't really sound like part of the story?
I don't think it's a big component in the copper market today. I think the issue is more how will brownfield growth and development of deposits occur over time in a market which is essentially supply constrained, and therefore which will run into deficits. Goldman Sachs has said that the deficit in the market will come maybe slightly later than many had anticipated, but I think there is a consensus view that the market is in shortage in the midterm and that more copper would be required, and there's not a lot available. So I think it's a good story. It's a positive story from the point of view of the outlook of the copper market.
Tell me, why do you think you're seeing resilience in China at a time when we sit here and talk about equity markets falling in China because of trade tensions, and there's other evidence in some of the survey data in China of some weakness at least, and yet is it just a question of time then before that feeds into demand for copper and other metals?
Well, we think in the case, the impact varies across metals, but in the case of copper, since most of it stays in China, we think that's the key element which moderates the impact on copper demand. If it were used for re-exports, then that story would be different. And what we've seen is that China has been applying countermeasures to counter the trade war. They've been stimulating the economy, and I think we're seeing more of that in the way of lowering bank reserve requirements and maybe incentivizing investment in infrastructure. So I think that's meant essentially that China's economic growth has not suffered significantly as of now. And I think they're managing through that quite well.
OK, so as of now. Talk to me a little bit about demand for copper in new technologies, electrical cars, and the like. Where excites you the most? Where are you having the most excited conversations with customers?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting story. Copper will play very strongly in the new economy, a cleaner, more sustainable economy. And I think certainly in clean transport and clean energy, copper is used widely. So in renewable energy, for example, generation in solar and wind, copper is used much more intensively than in conventional generation. And then you've got electromobility. That's a tremendous tailwind for copper demand. The expectation, the assumption on conservative basis is that the copper that goes into electromobility will probably multiply by 10 by 2030. So there's a growth
Tenfold.
there. Tenfold. So there's a significant growth behind that. Today, around 200,000 tons of copper go into electrical cars, and by 2030, probably that number is going to be closer to 2 million. So that's significant.
How big a part of the copper world is that, though? Is that a sort of small?
It's still, I mean, if it does get to around 2 million tons, it's around 8% of the copper market.